So one of the things that I really love about doing a YouTube channel that is both scholarly and also kind of fun is it gives me the chance to do those sorts of conversations where the scholarly and the fun kind of intersects. And in all honesty, there's nothing that's more fun than when you get to sort of hate watch something from antiquity. You know, when you're asked by a colleague or by someone organizing an event to respond to a text or an author that you really don't like. And ancient historians, if we're being honest, we have a lot of figures that we really don't like. But I think each of us have a pantheon of people that we really hate, who we hate what they stand for, we hate what they did, we hate how they write. And for me, the person who sort of sits at the center of that is Seneca. So what I want to do today is kind of recapitulate some ideas that I presented for a colleague a few weeks ago. And this focuses on a very famous letter by Seneca, the philosopher and Roman senator, who was also the tutor of the Emperor Nero. And it discusses a particular letter, letter 88 or Epistle 88, in which Seneca lays out what he believes to be the proper way to approach liberal arts training or humanistic training. And what you basically see in Seneca's account of this is a view of liberal studies that seems on a superficial level like it should be inclusive and energizing for those of us who are engaged in the study of antiquity or the study of the liberal arts. But in practice, what you see is an indictment of Seneca as an incredibly arrogant individual who has taken it upon himself to declare to everybody what kind of knowledge is useful. So I'll begin at the outset by saying that I really hate Seneca. I hated his style when I first read him as an undergraduate. I hated his pretensions of modesty when I read a sequence of letters in a reading group a few years ago. And now, as I've been doing some work on the reign of Nero for the book that I'm working on, I have begun to see that I really hate the retrograde attitudes that Seneca embodied as he tried to keep an Italian senatorial aristocracy in power while the imperial Senate struggled to be reborn into a better body. And I also hate the fact that he held so much debt that he almost single-handedly precipitated a revolt that overthrew Roman rule in Britain. In short, there's a whole lot I don't like about Seneca. And Epistle 88 or Letter 88 is something that embodies almost all of these distasteful qualities. So I'm going to say at the very beginning, if you're interested in this text, here's a couple of links to it. The English link, you can go to Wikisource and you can see more letters to Lucullus, Letter 88. If you read Latin and you're interested in looking at this from the Latin perspective, you can find that on the Perseus Projects page through Tufts. And the image here, I think, is actually quite interesting. This is a manuscript, a medieval manuscript that contains Seneca's letters to Lucullus. So this has part of this manuscript has Epistle 88 in it. And so you can kind of see what this looks like as it was passed down from antiquity. It's a very famous text, and it's been copied a lot of times, both in antiquity and leading up into the present time. So when this was a text that was first suggested by a colleague of mine that I might present it for a seminar, I did what my students do. I Googled it. Now, I'd read this text before, but it had been a very long time. And again, I hate Seneca, so I don't read Seneca as often as people who really like him, or maybe as often as I should. And so when I Googled it, the first thing that I found was a too long, didn't read it version of Epistle 88, in which the site basically summarized it as effectively saying that most of the liberal arts are worthless because they're at best preparatory tools for the study of philosophy and for training in virtue. And even though I dislike Seneca, there is, of course, much more to the letter than that. This is a more detailed and nuanced account than the too long, didn't read it version suggests. Seneca does, for example, speak at some length about other liberal studies besides philosophy. And he talks about what you can gain and what you should maybe leave out from it. So he tells us, for example, that poetry gives you tools so that you can understand meter. It gives you tools to understand language. It does not give you tools to understand meaning. Mathematics has some value. It will allow you to mark out the limits of your estate. It will allow you to measure a circle, but it gives you no ability whatsoever to measure what matters for a person or how to sketch out the boundaries of a good life. And art, physical activity, music, cooking, they're nice, but they're just for pleasure. So on a superficial level, for those of us interested in classical humanism in general and classical philosophy in particular, Epistle 88 gives us a couple of wonderful sound bites. After all, it begins with this powerful statement: I respect no study and deem no study good, which results in money making. Such studies, Seneca says, are profit-bringing occupations that are useful only insofar as they give the mind a preparation and do not engage it permanently. So one should linger upon them only so long as the mind can occupy itself with nothing better. These things are our apprenticeship, not our real work. Now, one of the things that, of course, becomes immediately clear here is Seneca has the luxury of not having to make money. He's a rich guy. And so he can say, this is a profession that, if you can occupy yourself with better things, you ought to do so. And so this seems like it offers us a very compelling justification for why we should study humanities, why we should study classics, why we should be interested in the Roman world, rather than, say, focusing on computer programming or finance or accounting, or even, enroll in the business economics major that now dominates so many U.S. universities. And so Seneca is your man if you're sitting in a dorm and you want to have a conversation with somebody about why philosophy is a good thing to do. Seneca is also your man if you need some sort of an ancient quote that you can recite at a dean or a university administrator or a concerned parent, or a tech brother who's talking to you about his VC funding in a cocktail party. What Seneca does is he offers you a powerful and compelling argumentation that, at least superficially, seems like it justifies the kinds of stuff that you might be spending your time with. That's all well and good. If you want to memorize a quote, that's a great quote to have. But the problem I have with this letter is that, we and Seneca both in theory agree that the study of something should not be simply about what particular pursuit makes the most money. We feel like we should like his argument, but really we shouldn't, because it's not a good argument, nor is it one that leads us to a place that produces the sort of virtuous learning that we desire. If in fact we analyze it a little more deeply, what we see is this is actually an argument that's infected with a peculiarly Senecan arrogance that infects it to such a degree that I think we need to go somewhere else if we want to find an actual argument to justify why we should study the past and why we should study the humanities. So let's start with a bit of a thought exercise. What happens if we modernize the type of argument that Seneca makes to justify the study of philosophy, to the exclusion of mathematics, art, philology, history, and just about anything else that anybody did in antiquity or now that someone might find interesting aside from philosophy? So not only will you be exhausted, but you'll also use up the vast amount of space in your head and be unable to actually fill it with virtuous ideas. And so the first part of this is we only have limited time. And if we spend time doing things that are not particularly serious, well, we'll run out of time to do things that are serious. The second argument is your mind is a finite thing. There's only so much space that you have in your mind. And if you spend all of that, or you devote all of that space to stuff like how does the meter in Homer's poetry work, or is Hesiod older than Homer, you end up with basically not enough space to focus on virtue. And so Seneca says, you must remove all superfluous things because virtue won't surrender itself to the narrow boundaries of our minds. And then he continues, he says, virtue actually requires a great wide space in which to move, and we should drive all other things out so that our emptied hearts can be filled with virtue. And a mind full of liberal arts is, to Seneca, like a room full of expensive but useless furniture, or a library full of books that we need to cut down with an axe. Measure the years of your life, Seneca writes in section 41, and you'll see that they have no room for all of these things like, well, rhetoric or poetry or art or cooking. So even if we forgive Seneca's wandering metaphors, I mean, who, even in antiquity, used an axe to get rid of books in their library or furniture from a crowded room, we're still left with an argument based on a set of images. In effect, Seneca is saying that the liberal arts might in fact be interesting, but we have neither the time nor the mental storage capacity to waste on them. So while it's interesting to consider whether Homer is older than Hesiod or how the scansion of a line of poetry works, our life is finite and our brains have a limited storage capacity, and we just can't spare the megabytes necessary to store data about Homer, when what we need to do is reserve that storage space for virtue. This is the very same argument that university administrators use against people who work on the humanities and in classics now. Classics, they say, is interesting, and our students might enjoy studying it, but it's not useful because it doesn't lead to what a dean might deem to be productive employment. It doesn't lead to large government grants. It doesn't lead to lucrative patents. It doesn't lead to exciting new ways to buy pet food over the internet. And so classics professors make less money than computer scientists or economists whose administrators say, do something useful. They don't get priority in the rooms in which they teach because administrators say economics classes deserve those spaces instead because they do something useful. And the argument there, again, is that these things like rooms and salaries are finite resources, and while the administration would like to fund everybody and give everybody equal opportunities, they must prioritize those studies that lead to outcomes that they believe are useful. And so they embrace a form of bureaucratic progress measured through metrics like high earning starting salaries for students that ignore things like the studies that show that philosophy majors, for example, over the lifetime of their career actually end up with a higher average salary than people who managed in finance. But this isn't the kind of thing that university leaders want to hear. In fact, this, though, is a modern twist on Seneca's argument. And sometimes you'll even see that university administrators will make this argument to our faces. A few years ago, I attended a fundraising dinner that included significant donors who were interested in supporting projects related to antiquity. In the course of the dinner, a senior administrator asked why anybody should fund work that's focused primarily on the ancient world because, and this is a paraphrase of what was said, what's the point of what's the point of funding the study of antiquity? I mean, everything good from antiquity is already baked into our society if it's worth knowing anyway, and we shouldn't spend any time or money on things we don't use. So I think that a lot of people who hear that, especially those of us who are interested in antiquity, would immediately say, well, there's a lot of problems with that idea. But many of the people who would say that the attitude this administrator has towards antiquity is a bit problematic love Seneca. Why? These basically are the same line of argument. Because both this administrator and my least favorite philosopher are arguing that there's limited space for knowledge, that knowledge must be prioritized in such a way that the things that are most useful are given time, attention, and resources. The things that are merely interesting or instrumental in our progress towards something greater are to be discarded. Because unfortunately, storage space and attention spans are limited, and we must always privilege the knowledge that produces a return. If we want to condemn this attitude among university administrators or among people who don't appreciate the past, we must also condemn it among people from the past. Because this is the same thing that Seneca is saying. So I guess we can pause and say, well, okay, but what if they're right? What if Seneca is actually right about some of these things? I mean, Seneca in 41 does say, a man who wishes to know many things must know such things as these, and must take no thought of all the time which one loses by ill health, public duties, private duties, daily duties, and sleep. Apply the measure of the years of your life And then you'll see that you have no room for stuff like, is Homer older than Hesiod, or how do you scan a line of poetry? Because again, you have a certain limited amount of time, and that limited amount of time is going to be cut into by the days that you're sick, the obligations that you have, and of course, sleep. So Seneca's right about that, right? Your time is limited. But he misses something very important, and I think he misses it quite deliberately. Genuine knowledge does not come simply from pure, elemental, and monolithically disciplinary ideas. It instead grows out of wide interdisciplinary study in which a lot of different things, a lot of different disciplinary elements come together to create interdisciplinary compounds. And so this is something that we can, I think, very much understand in our world. The metaphor that we should use is not that of Seneca's cluttered living room or overcrowded library. It's instead a different image, an image of a metallurgist's smelter in which ideas of all sorts come together, and then they're catalyzed. Reactions are catalyzed that blend these different ideas together into many different compounds. And so it starts out as a discrete batch of elements, becomes something better, stronger, and more vibrant than any of its individual parts. And this is what the liberal arts do for philosophy. So Seneca, for example, dismisses earlier thinkers. He says that pre-Socratics like Parmenides and Zeno of Elea are worthless. And he effectively says, you can throw up your hands about what to do with these things because all of these theories fit under the idea of liberal studies. They're superfluous because we know what truth is and it's not what they're putting forward. But there's a different way to think about philosophy, and there's a different way to think about knowledge, and there's a different way that ancient philosophers thought about how to put together all of these diverse ideas to create something better. So Seneca dismisses all of these things. He says that they're not worth your time, they're not worth your effort to know, they're not worth any sort of sense of understanding. You should instead just sweep them aside, just like everything else that has no benefit to you from the liberal studies. But there's another philosopher, a philosopher that I like a lot more than Seneca, who gives us an alternative that I think we should embrace. This is the philosopher Simplicius. Simplicius is a philosopher active in the 6th century AD. He's one of the famous philosophers who fled the Roman Empire for Persia when the Emperor Justinian closed the Athenian philosophical school in 529 and then confiscated its resources in 531 AD. Simplicius embarked upon philosophical study in a very different way from Seneca. What Simplicius did is he read everything. He read pre-Socratics, he read Stoics, he read Aristotelians, he read Platonists. Simplicius himself is a Platonic philosopher, but the way he understood Plato is to take the best of all of that previous knowledge and to combine it together into a set of readings of Plato that build upon the entire history of Greek philosophy from its very beginnings until Simplicius' own day in the 6th century AD. So he's working with over 1,000 years of material. And he's so comprehensive that the majority of the fragments we have of pre-Socratic philosophers come from Simplicius. But what Simplicius did with those fragments is even more interesting. He took them and put them together so that together they formed a more comprehensive and deeper understanding of the Platonic philosophical tradition he embodied. Seneca took those people, looked at them, said, I don't know what to do with them, and cast them away and threw them to the side. But Simplicius put them together with the understanding that pieces of knowledge have their own value. And if you're smart enough to see that value, you can put these pieces of knowledge together in a fashion that enhances and deepens the philosophy and the philosophical understanding that you're interested in. And this is an approach to philosophy that I wholeheartedly endorse, but it's also the answer that I gave to my administrator when he claimed that there was nothing useful to still learn from antiquity because everything that was good is already baked into what we already do now. Even if we accept the dubious premise, and I don't, that everything now is built only on what is worthwhile in the past, Knowledge is produced by reacting in new ways to ideas from the past that we now use, or by resurrecting old ideas that might have once been discarded. So to give just one example, Democritus, the pre-Socratic philosopher, might have been nothing more than a curiosity to Seneca, or even to Simplicius. But his old, discarded idea of atomic theory proved pretty useful when it was combined with more modern forms of empirical observation. It's now central to the way that we understand the world around us. And this is because knowledge grows exponentially as we experiment with how different, unrelated, and possibly antiquated notions might interact with each other. And this is why there needs to be a place in universities and in the wider world for the humanities and the liberal arts. And it's why we should leave Seneca aside and instead embrace Simplicius when deans or tech bros ask us what they should read. The future comes from knowing the past and applying its lessons in a new way, not from scrapping the past and scraping towards the kinds of pieces of a future that we would rather have. And so embrace the past, read the past, learn these texts, enjoy these texts, and most of all, in your joy, find a path forward to something that might unexpectedly be useful in a way that someone like Seneca could never imagine and would never acknowledge to be possible.